I've gone ahead behind the scenes and created a basic template for our invitation page where someone can accept their invitation. So let's take a look at this in the browser and see the work that we did in the previous lesson in action. So you can see here I'm visiting new code /1234, and this is a valid unused invitation, which you can see here in our SQL Pro database. So new code hasn't been used by anyone, so that page works, but used code actually has been used already. So if we change this to used code 1234, you see we get a 404 just like we expected based on the work we did in our tests. Similarly, if we just put in some sort of garbage code, you'll see that we also get a 404. So going back to the new code page here, what I'd like to work on next is actually test driving the endpoint that's going to receive this form submission so we can actually go ahead and create new users in the system and accept these invitations. So why don't we head back over to our editor and create a new test. So I'm going to keep this inside the accept invitation overall feature test, and we'll just create new test cases for the actual form endpoint. So why don't we create a new test here called something like registering with a valid invitation code. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and create an invitation for us to actually reference. So we'll give it a null user ID since that means it's unused and ready for someone to accept. And then we'll go ahead and make a post request to some endpoint for this form. So I think what I'm going to do is, just to kind of stick with Laravel's conventions, is we'll make this still the register endpoint and not some sort of invitation specific endpoint. So we'll just make a post request to register, but we're going to customize how registration works to make sure that a valid invitation code is actually provided in order for registration to actually occur. So when someone makes a post request to register, there's going to be 3 pieces of data that they need to pass through. The first one, of course, is going to be their email address. So why don't we just do something like john@example.com. The second one is going to be their password. So why don't we just do something like secret in this case. And then finally, it's required that they pass through an invitation code, right? Because otherwise we don't know if they even have a valid invitation code to register. So let's pass through this valid invitation code we have here, test code 1234, and then we can move on to figuring out what our assertions are going to be. So the first thing that I always like to do is make an assertion about the actual status code or what actually happened with the response, right? In this case, if someone registers successfully, where should they go? Well, the promoter's sort of home area, their kind of dashboard area, is their concerts page. So why don't we do something like response, assert redirect, backstage, concerts, to assert that when a promoter registers, they kind of get logged in and taken to this backstage area immediately. The next thing I think we want to do is actually verify that a user was created in the system. So why don't we do something like this, assert equals 1 user count, to make sure that a new user was created. And since, of course, we start with an empty database, this is going to, of course, be this new user, hopefully anyways. So now that we know that we have a user, we can actually retrieve that user by just saying user first. Since we know they're the only user, we don't have to do anything fancy with the query. And then we can make some assertions about the actual user, like making sure that their email was stored correctly, their password was stored correctly, and maybe making sure that the invitation was actually marked as used as well. So why don't we do something like this, assert equals john@example.com for the user's email. I will do the same thing for their password, except password is a little bit tricky because we can't just check that their plain text password was saved to the database, right? We want to make sure that it gets hashed and stuff properly. So we can actually do this pretty easily by doing an assert true on hash check and then saying that their hashed password, after rehashing the word secret with whatever salt and however many rounds and whatever algorithm was stored in their password, actually comes out to the same hash at the end of the day. So here we can just say user password, and we can know that as long as this comes back as true, that their password was actually stored properly, and they'll be able to log in using whatever password they specified here. Finally, we want to make sure that the invitation has been marked as used now. So why don't we just verify that the user associated with the invitation is this user that we just created. So why don't we just say this, assert true, invitation, fresh, to refresh it from the database, user, to get the associated user, which we're just going to kind of assume we've set up, which we haven't yet. let's make sure that the user associated with the invitation is the user that was just created. So I think this is going to be enough to get us going and get us to implement the happy path of submitting this form. So why don't we go ahead and run this test and see what our first error is. Okay, so it looks like there is no register route. That's why we're getting a 404 instead of some sort of redirect. So let's head over to our routes file and define this endpoint. So why don't we stick it under login here. We'll do route post to register, and we'll have this hit the auth register controller just to kind of follow Laravel's conventions. And I'm pretty sure that the method name is register, so we'll just roll with that. Again, just to be conventional, even though this isn't quite, as RESTful or CRUD-based as a lot of the other actions that we've been using. But we'll name this auth.register, and then just go ahead and run the test again and see what that gets us. Okay, so it looks like we are getting redirected, but we're getting redirected somewhere different. And the reason for this is that Laravel's auth scaffolding has already put in place a register controller for us. So since we're trying to drive this out with TDD our own way, I think what we really want to do here is actually just wipe out the entire contents of this controller. We don't want to rely on anything that's there already. We want to define our own custom behavior here. So let's just save that, remove any imports that we're not using yet, and head back to the test and run it again and see what we get now. Hopefully this time we're going to get an error that there is no register method. Okay, so we get a 500. So why don't we disable exception handling so we can see the real error here. So without exception handling at the top of our test, run it again. Scrolling up, method register does not exist on the register controller. Let's go ahead and add that method and just leave it empty and run the test again. So we'll have a register method here. Running the tests, we get a 200 is not a redirect status code. So this just returned an empty 200 response instead of a redirect. So why don't we go ahead and return a redirect back to the correct spot here. So if we go ahead and take a look at our routes file, we probably have a name for this, Backstage Concerts Index. So let's just use the named route in this case. So we'll do a redirect, route, Backstage Concerts Index. Go ahead and run this test again. And now we get an error that we expected 1, but we got 0. And that's related to the number of users in the system. So we have to make sure that we're actually creating a user now. So let's head over to the register controller and quickly drive that out. So we can say something like user equals user create. And we know we got to specify some stuff here, right? So why don't we just go ahead and do it really naively to start. We'll just say email is going to be request email. Let's just say password is going to be request password, even though this isn't what we want because we want to make sure that we hash it. But this will get us to our next error at least. Let's go ahead and run this again. And scrolling up, we get an error that there is no user class found in the controller's auth namespace. So let's make sure that we import our user here. Always an easy mistake to make. Running the test again, we need to make sure that we import our hash facade in the test. So let's just import that, and you can see up at the top we've pulled in Illuminate Support Facades hash. And now if we run this test, hopefully we get a different error. Okay, so now we're getting an error that we expected true, but we got false on line 75. And this is to do with our hashing. So because we're not storing the password hashed, we're just storing it in plain text, this fails. So it's nice to have this test to make sure that we don't make that mistake. So if we head over to the controller, instead of just storing the password, we can actually go ahead and use the bcrypt helper to hash this. And now if we run this test again, with any luck, we're past that error. Okay, so now we're getting an error to call to a member function is on null on line 76. So that means that the user associated with the invitation is coming back as null because we haven't actually defined a relationship for that yet. So let's head over to the invitation, and why don't we just add that relationship method right here. So we'll create a belongs to relationship called user. And if we go ahead and run the test again, let's see what our next error is. Okay, so we're still getting a call to a member function is on null, but this time I don't think it's because we haven't set up the relationship. It must be because we aren't actually storing that relationship, right? So let's head over to the register controller and make sure that we do that. So we're going to need to make sure that we actually have the invitation so that we can update the invitation with the new user ID. So let's use some similar code as we did in the other controller. We can say invitation is equal to invitation find by code. And now that code is coming in through the request now. So now that we have this invitation, we can create that user. And then once the user is created, we can go ahead and update the invitation to set the invitation's user ID to the ID of the user that we just created. So once we've set that, with any luck, this will get us a little bit closer to a passing test. So let's run it again. And now we're getting an error that we don't have an invitation class in that namespace. Again, the classic namespacing error. So let's make sure that we import invitation here as well. Run this test, scroll on up, no query results for model invitation. Interesting. So I think the problem here is we're passing it through as invitation code in the request, but in the controller, we were just looking for code. So let's update this to invitation code, run the test again, and see what we're onto now. So now we're getting an error about a mass assignment exception. So we're trying to set the user ID on the invitation, but that is a guarded property. So to get around that, we can do our classic move here of just saying protected guarded equals empty array, which is a totally safe thing to do as long as you have an internal policy of never using request all to mass assign to your models. So if we go and run this test again now, I'm really hoping this time it's green, and it is. Fantastic. There's one assertion that we're missing though, and that is that we haven't verified that when the user is created, that they're actually automatically logged in. Because if someone is redirected to Backstage Concerts, you'll see that what happens is they end up hitting a 404, right? Because they're not allowed to see that, or a 401 unauthorized or whatever, because they're not actually logged in yet. So how can we verify that the user that was created was also logged in? Well, thankfully, Laravel has a helpful helper assertion for this. So we can say this assert authenticated as, and then pass through that user. And now Laravel will confirm that after this response came back that this user is now authenticated. So with any luck, this should be back to failing now. And it is. The current user is not authenticated. Perfect. So if we head over to our register controller, after we update the invitation, before we redirect, we can say auth, login, pass through the user, make sure that we import the auth facade, and go ahead and run this test again. And hopefully now we've logged in that user successfully. And we have. Perfect. In the next lesson, let's take a look at trying to register with an invitation that's already been used.